For much of modern history, Western Canada's natural wealth followed a path that few ever questioned. Before wheat, minerals, or fertilizer could reach Europe, Asia, or any other global market, they almost always moved south first. That pattern was treated as natural, efficient, even inevitable. But it was never about geography. It was about infrastructure. Rail lines, ports, freight corridors, and logistics systems were designed in a way that centered American control. Capacity existed south of the border. Scheduling power existed there. Storage, handling, and pricing leverage existed there. Over time, that design hardened into dependence. Canadian resources did not merely pass through the United States. They became structurally reliant on American infrastructure to reach the rest of the world. Canada is now trying to undo that. When Mark Carney spoke in Winnipeg in November 2025, standing alongside the Manitoba Premier after announcing new rail funding, he was not talking about repairing an old line or preserving legacy infrastructure. He was describing a deliberate shift in Canada's trade architecture. The message was simple but radical. American routes would no longer be mandatory. They would become optional. The Hudson Bay Railway, long dismissed as marginal, was being repositioned as a strategic corridor, one that connects the Canadian prairies directly to Europe through the Arctic, without touching American soil and without paying American fees. For more than 100 years, Western Canadian exports had only one realistic gateway to global markets. Grain moved through American ports. Minerals traveled on American railways. Even shipments ultimately destined for Europe or Asia were routinely routed through U.S. infrastructure, not by preference, but because that is where capacity existed. At every stage, American entities collected value, fees at ports, charges on rail networks, premiums for storage and scheduling. American logistics companies set priorities. American terminals control flow. Canadian exporters paid for access to infrastructure they did not own and could not influence. This arrangement persisted because the alternative barely functioned. The Hudson Bay Railway stretches roughly 1,300 kilometers north, crossing permafrost and muskeg to reach Churchill on the Arctic coast. For decades, it was chronically underfunded, seasonally constrained, and operated at standards too low for serious commercial traffic. The shipping season through Hudson Bay was short. The port lacked scale. The rail line could not handle heavy freight or modern volumes. Southern routes, while more expensive, were faster and more reliable. By the 1990s, Ottawa had effectively given up on the idea that this corridor mattered. The railway and port were sold to a private American company for $1. Not $1 million. $1. That price reflected a judgment. The infrastructure was seen as having no meaningful future value. Under private ownership, conditions deteriorated further. Investment was minimal. Maintenance was deferred. When severe flooding destroyed sections of the line in 2017, the owner chose not to rebuild. The railway was left unusable for over a year. Churchill was cut off from surface transportation entirely. At that point, most observers assumed the story was finished. Instead, it was just beginning. In 2018, a coalition of First Nations communities and northern Manitoba towns acquired the railway and port, forming what became known as the Arctic Gateway Group. At the time, the move was widely interpreted as symbolic, important for reconciliation and regional control, but commercially insignificant. Few believed that global trade would ever flow through Churchill at scale again. What almost no one anticipated was how quickly geopolitics would transform the value of neglected infrastructure. As trade tensions with the United States escalated, particularly under renewed protectionist rhetoric and explicit challenges to Canadian economic autonomy, Canada faced a strategic choice. It could negotiate endlessly from a position of dependence, or it could invest its way out of vulnerability. Infrastructure became the battlefield. Rather than responding only with counter-tariffs or legal disputes, Canadian policymakers began asking a deeper question. Why should Canadian exports depend on foreign-controlled infrastructure at all? That question reframed the Hudson Bay Railway overnight. What had once been dismissed as uneconomic now appeared underutilized. What had been written off as obsolete began to look like leverage. Not nostalgia, strategy. To make that strategy real, the railway had to be transformed. Railways in North America are classified by track quality, load capacity, and reliability. Class 1 is the highest standard. Heavy axle loads, long unit trains, sustain high-volume freight, and predictable performance. Most major freight corridors in Canada and the United States operate at or near this level. The Hudson Bay Railway did not. It operated under strict weight limits. Speeds were constrained. Heavy unit trains, the backbone of modern bulk logistics, could not run. The line simply could not compete. That is why the November 2025 announcement mattered. Federal and provincial governments committed $262 million to upgrade the entire corridor to Class 1 standards. This was not routine maintenance. It was full reconstruction. Track beds redesigned to stabilize permafrost movement. New rail and ties rated for heavy loads. Bridges and culverts rebuilt. Drainage systems upgraded. Most importantly, the railway was rebuilt as a digital system. Ground-penetrating radar maps subsurface conditions. LiDAR produces precise three-dimensional track models. Drones conduct regular inspections across remote stretches. Sensors monitor ground movement continuously. Artificial intelligence analyzes the data to predict failures before they occur. This is not reactive maintenance. It is predictive infrastructure management. The result is transformative. Freight cars once too heavy for the line can now operate safely. Unit trains hauling grain, potash, minerals, and equipment in economically meaningful volumes can reach Churchill. Reliability improves to the point where long-term commercial contracts become viable. That reliability is what changes behavior. Grain producers in Saskatchewan and Manitoba gain access to a shorter route to European markets. Potash exports, 95% of Saskatchewan production, can move without relying on American logistics networks. Critical minerals from across central and northern Canada can be shipped directly to European refineries. Energy corridors become feasible. Arctic resupply operations become more efficient and less costly. Add these flows together, and the volumes reach tens of millions of tons annually. Move through infrastructure entirely under Canadian control. The United States does not lose all Canadian trade. Southern routes remain faster for some destinations. Pacific markets still depend on Vancouver. But what disappears is monopoly by default. For the first time in generations, Canadian exporters have a real choice. And once companies begin routing through Churchill and discover that the economics work, they do not return simply because American ports offer temporary discounts. Optionality reshapes pricing. It shifts leverage. It forces competition where none existed before. There is no policy tool in Washington that can reverse this. Tariffs cannot stop a railway upgrade in Manitoba. Trade disputes cannot compel Canadian firms to ignore better alternatives. Diplomatic pressure cannot force dependence when independence becomes economically rational. The Hudson Bay Railway failed for 90 years for one reason: permafrost. But technology has changed. Monitoring, prediction, and adaptive engineering now manage conditions that once destroyed track. Climate change, paradoxically, extend the Arctic shipping season, further improving viability. What was marginal a century ago is now competitive. This is about more than railways and ports. It is about demonstrating that American infrastructure is not indispensable. For generations, dependence gave leverage. Threats exposed that leverage. Investment removed it. Every shipment through Churchill instead of an American port is proof that Canadian trade can function independently. Every dollar invested in northern infrastructure reduces future vulnerability, and other countries are watching. The Hudson Bay Railway, long dismissed as a historical artifact, is becoming proof that sovereignty is not rhetoric. It is built, maintained, used. The intention was to show Canada had nowhere else to go. Instead, Canada went north and built an alternative no one can stop.